The morning the boardroom turned on its hinge, the weather did the same. Rain stitched fine lines down the glass wall, and the city grayed out like an old blueprint. The espresso in my cup carried the faint smell of toast and bitter chocolate, comforting and inadequate. I'd slept maybe 4 hours, my mind pacing the same corridor of worries. The Harper East redevelopment, the cost overrun on Phase Divu, and whether the new CEO would keep faith with the team or with the board that hired him. We'd renovated this room a decade earlier. My recommendations, my drawings, my insistence on transparency without exposure. The glass was low iron to keep the view true. The sound baffling had been elegant enough to vanish. The lighting had a dimmable warmth that hid fatigue and favored no one. These things had mattered to me once the way a person's quiet habits matter. The straightened pens, the aligned folders, the names committed to memory long after everyone else stopped trying. I was 47 and sensible. My name is Meredith Quinn, Senior Director of Urban Projects at Westbrook and Lyle. The firm specialized in mixed-use planning that was supposed to bring life back to tired blocks without grinding out the people who'd managed to love them anyway. I'd come up drawing sidewalks and bus stops and small parks inside difficult corners. I'd stayed because drawing felt like a way to argue with despair and sometimes win. He arrived at 8:59 with the storm on his coat. Ethan Riddle, 3 months into his tenure, the firm's 5th CEO in 12 years. The industry liked to eat its leaders. He had the look of a man who knew that and had come anyway. Dark suit, restrained tie, a face handsome mostly because it was careful. I'd watched him make choices in the first weeks. All the little signals. He said please to the junior analyst who wrestled the projector cable. He stood when the elderly founder came in. He never joked at anyone's expense, and when a rumor walked by he let it pass. He set his folder on the table, looked across 15 faces, and then, unexpectedly, looked at mine as if measuring something quiet I'd left on a windowsill. "We're moving the Harper discussion forward," he said. His voice had that low, unforced clarity that makes other people do the work of leaning in. "We need a recommendation today." The presentation slid across the screen. Numbers, contours, risk. The developers wanted a bigger footprint, the neighborhood coalition wanted smaller shadows, and the city wanted something it could cut a ribbon on before the next election. I'd spent my weekend walking the site, counting trees, listening to old arguments in new accents. I knew the stories now. The deli where a kid once learned chess from a retired postman, the corner where a woman saw her son dance with his boyfriend in daylight for the first time. We talked, politely. People said things like synergy and brand extension and narrative alignment. The rain ratcheted up on the glass. I wrote notes in my small block letters and tried not to think about how much of leadership is theater staged for people who already know the ending. Ethan listened, eyes narrowed not in skepticism but in concentration. He'd learned our faces quickly. He knew who loved a fight, who flinched when pressed, who could be counted on to catch a dropped thread and tie it off neatly. Then he did the thing I didn't expect. "Meredith," he said, gentle and direct, "you've been quiet. What's your opinion on the revision plan?" In 17 years I had been asked for my opinion 1,000 times. My value to the firm was precisely that I would give it without ornament or apology. But not here. Not this morning. Not with the board present and the stakes arranged like expensive glassware. I took a breath that tasted like metal and coffee. My pulse climbed into my throat and stayed there like a guest who wouldn't learn the door code. 2 points, I said, keeping my voice low. First, the plaza. If we widen the retail frontage and pinch the landscape setback, We kill the stop-and-stay behavior that keeps a block from being a corridor. Second, light. If the tower shifts 12 feet south, we keep winter sun on the east sidewalk. The developers get rentable square footage. The neighborhood gets warmth. It's math and mercy at once. Silence draped itself, then thinned. Someone cleared a throat. Someone else shifted paper for the sound of it. The CFO frowned the way a person frowns when a shoe rubs. The board chair watched Ethan, not me. Ethan's mouth softened by a millimeter. "Thank you," he said. "That's useful." Useful is what you call something you are going to defend later for reasons that aren't entirely numerical. Useful is a word that knows what it owes you. We moved on. The light skated across steel table edges. The rain backed off. The decision, when it came, was called provisional, which is the corporate word for fragile. We stood to leave and tucked our chairs back in their exact places. People smiled at me with complicated mouths. In the reflection of the glass, I looked composed enough to fool the kind of person who wants to be fooled. He stopped by my office at dusk, coat over 2 fingers, tie loosened. The cleaning crew's vacuums hummed on another floor like far-off peas. He leaned in the doorway, not entering in that deliberate way that says, "I understand the boundary, and I have come to honor it in public even if I consider stepping over it in private." "You forced the conversation," he said. "Thank you." I gave my opinion. I kept my hands flat on the desk so I wouldn't animate what didn't need animation. "You asked." "I did." His eyes took a quick inventory of my books, the framed photograph of my daughter at her college graduation, the ceramic cup a client's child had made and gifted because I'd remembered her name. "I asked because I've watched you avoid theater for as long as I've been here. That's rare." I wanted to say that avoiding theater is expensive. It costs promotions and invitations and the warm fog of belonging. Instead I said, "It's efficient." He smiled, not with his mouth so much as with his attention. "Walk me through your math again tomorrow." The words were simple. The implication was not. I told him I would. When he left, the echo he carried with him, soap and the faint sweetness of paper, and whatever cologne smells like restraint, took a moment longer than it should have to dissolve. I packed my bag in the old ritual: pens, notebook, laptop, the small folded list my mother used to live by: bread, milk, kindness. It was a superstition of hers, a grocery list for the spirit. I kept it close because it kept me honest. The elevator hummed. In the polished steel I was the age I am, which is to say no longer the age that is taken for granted, and not yet the age that is congratulated for being visible. Outside, the rain had quit. The street smelled like a promise that didn't say of what. We worked late after that. Not in the way that becomes a rumor by itself, but in the way that becomes one when watched for. He asked me for the kind of things leaders pretend not to need: the quiet context, the historical bones behind a stubborn policy, the names of people who do not speak up because they have learned how expensive the bill can be. I offered what I could without acquiring debt. At night, the office was another animal. The open floor echoed, the printer lights blinked like city windows. The skyline put its jewelry on. I'd walk drafts down to the conference room and find him there, jacket on the chair back, glasses on the table, sleeves rolled. We talked in a register 1 notch softer than day. I found I liked the shape of the quiet between us, the way it held without crowding. I told him what the East Side tenants feared, not the new but the uniformity of newness. I told him what the neighborhood association wanted that it might not know it wanted: benches that faced each other so strangers could become not strangers. He asked about small things: the height of a curb, the pressure of a door closer. And he asked the dangerous large ones too. Where the dignity lives in a municipal budget, where the dignity goes when a development succeeds and the wrong people win. Sometimes our hands touched over a printout. Sometimes he leaned in too close and then eased back as if he'd remembered a rule he himself had written. Once his fingertips rested on the table next to mine, and the contact sang, soft as a struck glass. I'd been divorced 7 years by then. The ache had gone from operatic to orchestral, and then to a chamber piece, the kind of music you can work by. My daughter called on Sundays and told me her life in paragraphs that made me proud and gently lonely. I had not been touched in a way that turned the temperature of a room in a long time. I hadn't missed it until I did, and then I did with a clarity that embarrassed me. The office gossiped the way offices do. It's the sound of a space inhaling its own air. I heard my name once in the kitchen hush and pretended I had not. I wore neutrality like a well-cut coat. When he stopped at my doorway, he timed it so others would see it, and so they would see that nothing happened there except work. It was not a lie. It was a decision not to tell a story we hadn't yet agreed to live inside. The crisis arrived dressed in inevitability. An internal mock-up of the tower's new massing appeared on a civic blog that prided itself on transparency, the way a gossip column prides itself on concern. The rendering was early and ugly and easily misunderstood. The neighborhood coalition swore at it, then swore at us. The developer pretended panic and privately sharpened his pencil over leverage. The city called to remind us of the promise of community consultation while hinting at the promise of deadlines that could not be missed. We convened. The board's temperature rose. HR sent out that email whose tone is a posture. We take confidentiality seriously. Legal asked whose credentials touched which files and when. You could feel the narrative pushing toward a scapegoat the way water pushes toward the lowest place. My name was on 4 access logs. Of course it was. My job was to touch the thing until it became the thing it needed to be. His name was on 6. Of course it was. Leaders read what they have to read, and then they read what they should. They didn't call it an investigation at first, just a review of internal processes. People spoke softly around me in the tone you use when someone you like has just become expensive to defend. He called me into his office. The blinds were open. He stayed 2 steps back of closeness. "We'll sort this," he said. His voice had a new weight, like a man shouldering a beam. "I know it wasn't you." "I know it wasn't you," I said, because there are sentences that must be said twice to become true enough to stand up. "They will want a story that looks clean," he said. "Clean stories travel faster than accurate ones." "I'm not good at clean stories," I said. "I'm good at structures that stand." He looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen on him before, or perhaps had not permitted myself to see. That's what I hired myself for. The review hardened into investigation in 3 days. HR scheduled the conversations behind doors with quiet hinges. Legal's eyes tired. The board chair called me Meredith with an extra layer of frost. I did what I have always done. Told the truth in complete sentences without embroidery. On the 4th day, someone leaked a different thing. A timeline that made me look like a convenient door left ajar. It was tidy but wrong. People began to speak my name as a moral question. One evening I walked the stairwell because I needed the work of climbing and heard voices a flight below say the phrase "too close to him." That was when my hands shook. I did not cry. I am not built for show. But I did sit in my office with the door shut, lights off, and listen to the building settle, the HVAC sighing, the weather radio on a construction site across the street muttering numbers about gusts and visibility. I thought of my daughter laughing under a string of dorm room lights, of the deli chessboard, of the old woman who wheeled her groceries up the east sidewalk in sunlight. I thought of what it costs to keep your name clean when the river is rising. HR placed me on administrative leave pending outcome. The phrase did its job. It sounded like caution and felt like exile. He could not stop it without admitting that he could stop it. This is the paradox they don't put in leadership books. He stood in the hallway as I turned in my badge. Our eyes met like people who know they should nod and not more. He nodded. So did I. The elevator doors were brushed steel and did not reflect enough to be a mirror. Men in suits eventually find the person who will sell them the story they want to buy. The leak, it turned out, traced back to an external consultant with a casual relationship to NDAs and a fondness for attention. The evidence was boring. IP addresses and login times, and the one email he forgot to delete that said everything the patient work of forensics had already said. My name cleared fully and without qualification. The email used those exact words, and I read them twice to be sure. But the stain stayed in the fabric. People are made of memory and desire, not of formal exonerations. I could return, the firm said, at once. The board chair called it regrettable. HR said misunderstanding. Legal said nothing. My team sent messages that made my throat ache. The intern who'd watched me like a planet wrote, "We're better when you're here." I went back for one afternoon to find my desk undisturbed in exactly the way you dust around an object you think belongs to someone else. I looked at the plant the receptionist had remembered to water. I touched the edge of the ceramic cup. I listened for my name in the murmur and heard only caution. He came to my doorway and waited. He'd shaved too fast and nicked himself. The small brown square on his jaw looked like an old-fashioned bandage on a new-fashioned man. "Coffee?" he asked. It was a notion, not a plan. We walked to a place 2 blocks away where the barista remembered my order and pretended not to recognize him. We stood because sitting would have suggested a conversation with an ending. "I could have stopped the leave if I'd thrown weight around," he said at last, watching the street traffic instead of me. "If I had done that, it would have cost me precisely the influence I needed to keep the board from throwing you to the wolves. My calculation felt righteous until I saw you carry your box to the elevator." "There was no box," I said. "I didn't take anything." He nodded, admitting the metaphor. "I'm sorry." He didn't crowd me with pleas. He didn't dress his apology in beautiful rags. The restraint hurt more than a performance would have. My anger would have preferred a target to knock over. "I don't know what to do with this," I said. "Any of it." He answered like a man who had practiced not lying. "I don't, either. I know I respect you. I know I am drawn to the part of you that refuses theater even when the stage is bright. I know we cannot afford to be seen learning what else is true." "Then this is a corridor," I said. "We walk it, or we close it." He looked down at my hands wrapped around the paper cup. "I've always liked corridors," he said softly. "They make choices honest." We didn't touch. The space between us felt like a hallway lit by motion sensors. Bright, then dim, then bright again. I resigned the next morning, the kind of letter that fits on one page. I kept my explanations short because explanations are mortgages, and I wanted to own the rest of my life free and clear. He acknowledged, accepted, and sent a separate message that said only, "Thank you for your work on Harper. It will stand." I rented a small studio that smelled like paint and possibility. Consulting grew around me like ivy, slow at first, then suddenly everywhere. I took the projects that let me sleep, safer crossings by a school, a library renovation that kept the old reading chairs. I learned how the afternoon light moves in my space, how coffee grounds feel between finger and thumb when you're deciding whether to brew a second pot you don't quite need. Once, on a wet Tuesday, I found a parcel at my door. A book of photographs of mid-century civic buildings, the inscription in a hand I recognized. To work that asks for its dignity. No signature. I kept it anyway. News travels in this industry like weather. You look up and it's changed. Harper advanced. The city smiled for pictures and pretended not to know what it costs to reach ribbon cutting. A profile of the firm appeared in a trade magazine, and there he was, careful jaw and careful words, crediting the voices you don't hear at podiums. I turned the page and told the empty room that humility used to be a virtue and is now a strategy. I said it fondly and not. He appeared in my life again at a conference the next spring. The hotel carpet, a symmetrical pattern designed to withstand heavy suitcases and regret. I was presenting on light, literal sunlight, and the figurative version neighborhoods need. He sat in the back and listened without blinking the way he does when he is telling himself not to agree out loud. After, he stood near the coffee urn and waited for me to look up. I did. We walked to a quieter hallway, past a ballroom open on one end where staff in black moved chairs in rows. Pattern, precision, the small choreography of service. I came to hear you, he said. That part is simple. Simple. I had not thought of any part of this as simple in a long time. You could have emailed, I said. It wasn't a rebuke so much as a map. Here is where we are. Here is the distance we've chosen. I could have, he said. But I wanted to stand in a room and feel what your work does to a room. We paused by a window that framed the slick parking lot and a sky elongated by hotel glass. Staff laughter rose behind a door and then was gone. I miss you, he said, finally. The words weren't theatrical, and they weren't a trap. They were information. My body registered them first. Heat like the first step into sunlight after a movie matinee. My mind followed at a slower adult pace. I don't know if missing is safe, I said. It isn't, he said. But sometimes the safe thing is a way of not choosing. I have spent a career choosing, and I don't want to pretend otherwise with you. You're still the CEO, I said, because someone had to say it out loud. You still work in a building where rooms multiply their ears when we stand too close. Yes, he said. And you are still you, which is the point. He didn't reach for me, and I didn't move toward him. The elevator at the end of the corridor opened and closed, a punctuation mark we did not use. Harper opens in October, he said, as if the date might be a key to some door we had not yet admitted was locked. I know, I said. I designed a bench that faces another bench. If people fall in love there, I get a small cut. He smiled then, the private smile I had not earned and had earned anyway. I'll send the paperwork. We exchanged no promises. Promises bring invoices. We parted as two people who had learned, sometimes painfully, the difference between momentum and decision. I visited the plaza 6 months later, slipping toward evening when ordinary beauty has its best chances. The pavers clicked underfoot with that clean sound new plazas make. Kids ran through the spray jets, their shrieks edged with pride. The Deli had kept its chessboard. The table was scuffed in a way that says use. Light lay across the east sidewalk like a blessing you could step into and out of freely. People sat on the facing benches and became not strangers, just as I had hoped. He was there, of course he was, but he stood at the far edge without inserting himself into anyone's joy. Leaders rarely get to witness what lasts. The job pulls them back inside for the next crisis. I watched him watch a pair of teenagers become brave enough to dance and saw his shoulders lower, a fraction. He sensed me before he saw me. The way you feel the weather change across your skin. When he turned, we didn't wave. We walked to a place between the benches, not quite private, not quite public, and let our eyes do what they'd learned to do. Speak in declaratives without declaring too much. You were right about the light, he said. It makes people generous. You were right about the corridor, I said. Sometimes it leads where it should. We stood. The plaza did its work around us. Commerce, laughter, the delicate math of strangers negotiating space. A saxophone sang something like the idea of jazz 2 blocks away. Scent of basil from a pizzeria, engine heat cooling, children's breath making the air look almost visible. His hand was close to mine and trembled once. The smallest declaration a body can make, and still claim plausible deniability. We could try dinner, he said. Somewhere we can be ordinary for 2 hours. If there's a camera, we can let it catch what it will and let the world do what it always does. I am tired of living as if explanations are more important than experience. The part of me that has always kept the ledger opened the book and poised the pen. The other part, older than the ledger and wiser than the pen, set both down. Yes, I said. We didn't step closer there among benches I had drawn and faces I had drawn them for. We didn't turn the plaza into a stage. We let the scene keep its integrity. Later we would choose the smaller room with the candle in its glass, and the conversation that slows to a warmth just short of flame. Later I would tell him the story of the day my daughter phoned to say the world had surprised her and how my body remembered joy like a first language. He would tell me about the year he slept 5 hours a night and thought he was protecting himself when he was only neglecting to live. Later, the night would soften and the window would show our reflections blurred together like a draft an artist intends to keep. The rest would fade where it should, into breath and promise, into the closing distance between 2 people who have earned ordinary tenderness the long way. For now, we walked the edges of the plaza while the lights came on a few at a time. The way a city nods to itself, the way a person does when they consent to be seen. We didn't hurry. We had spent so much time rushing toward solutions, away from blame, into rooms whose glass was designed for transparency and practiced for surveillance. The evening required another pace. As we reached the corner, the first drops returned, small and clean. He offered his jacket, and I shook my head, not out of performance but principle. I had my own weathered coat. I had my own weathered life. I had chosen the part of it I wanted to share. He adjusted his stride to mine. It was a small thing. It felt like a promise, or maybe a proof. Behind us, the plaza corrected itself around every person who entered it, allowing space for what they brought and what they couldn't help bringing. In the glass of the newest storefront, I watched our shadows run nearly together, and then apart and then nearly together again, the way shadows do when the light comes from many places at once. The office lights of the city dimmed one by one as we crossed the street. His shadow lingered close to mine, and then it was simply beside it, and then, without fanfare, it overlapped, as if to say, I am here, and I will be, and the rest we can decide. We turned the corner and let the rain decide the route. Choice, not chance, but also a little grace. Always a little grace.